Marcus Steele always felt like he was destined to be invisible in a world that demanded attention by force. Yet life had other plans for him. On a chilly Wednesday morning in Dayton, Ohio, after a night of persistent drizzle that left the sky a perpetually smoldering gray, he stepped off a bright yellow school bus in front of Dayton Central High. Clutching his well-worn backpack strap tighter than he ever had before, Marcus tried desperately to blend into the muted crowd that drifted through the halls like autumn leaves. His heart pounded with the quiet resignation of a man who had grown accustomed to being disregarded, but that day fate had already begun to stir up a storm he wished he could ignore. From the moment Marcus crossed the threshold of Dayton Central, the difference was palpable. Unlike the modest halls of his old school in Gary, Indiana, these corridors vibrated with a fierce cacophony of voices, filled with laughter and whispers that sometimes slid into hurtful jabs. In this new realm, every smile and sneer seemed laden with an unspoken challenge. Marcus, who dressed simply in faded blue jeans, an oversized hoodie and well-worn sneakers that told tales of harsh winters past, was too different to go unnoticed. His gentle presence, peppered with a soft accent and an air of quiet dignity, became an uninvited spectacle amid the chaos of teenage cliques and boisterous chatter. During his first day, Marcus's routine unfolded like the pages of a book he never wanted to read aloud. He entered the main office and received a neatly printed schedule from a receptionist whose practiced smile did little to hide an undercurrent of condescension. "Welcome to Dayton Central, Marcus Steele," she greeted him in a tone that seemed rehearsed for every new arrival, as if the institution itself already knew of his otherness. "If you get lost, just ask one of the student aides. You'll be fine," she added, words that floated away like empty promises. With a slight nod of gratitude, Marcus slid into the maze-like corridors, determined to keep his head down and his heart guarded. In his American history class, seated at the very back where one might hope invisibility could be cloaked under the cover of distance, Marcus found no solace from the murmurs and curious glances. The room was a battleground of subtle hostilities and overt microaggressions. A stocky boy with pale skin and a tousled buzz cut, whose name Marcus would later come to recognize as Cody, leaned over toward his friend and whispered a remark laced with disdain. Their laughter, ringing out like the cruel peal of a bell, was a harsh reminder of the prejudice that punctuated every glance Marcus received. Determined to shut out the cruelty, he focused instead on the passing of time marked by the tick of a clock. Each moment a small victory against the world's dismissive indifference. By noon, Marcus had adapted a survival routine, one that involved speaking only when absolutely necessary and keeping his eyes lowered to avoid confrontations that might ignite a tempest of ridicule. He sat alone at a corner table in the bustling cafeteria, eating a peanut butter sandwich lovingly prepared by his mother back home. The simple meal was a small comfort amid the chatter of students whose casual camaraderie was tainted by undercurrents of hostility. Even as he savored each bite, he couldn't escape the feeling of being the outsider in a world that openly displayed its bias. His skin color, his accent, and his quiet demeanor marked him as different, an anomaly that some could not help but scrutinize with unwarranted suspicion. The most persistent of these hostile glances came from Cody. With his unruly hair and restless energy that seemed to exist solely to find a target, Cody was the embodiment of teenage aggression. With him were his cronies Brent and TJ, whose every action amplified the threat they posed. Brent, tall and wiry with a perpetual habit of cracking his knuckles, and TJ, broad and imposing like a pit bull on a long, hungry stretch without a meal, made sure that Cody's derisive smirks were never far from Marcus's sight. Throughout lunch and even into his first gym class, their behavior was never subtle. A careless bump here, a sneering comment there, each act a deliberate reminder that Marcus, with his quiet determination, was an easy target for ridicule and disdain. After school, as the last remnants of daylight danced around a dilapidated old gym with broken vending machines and cracked concrete steps, Marcus's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. A text from his grandfather, a retired Marine and Vietnam vet known for his steadfast character, offered a familiar reassurance. "Everything okay today? Need me to pick you up?" read the message, and though a small smile tugged at Marcus's lips, The comfort was fleeting. His mind churned with memories of the old neighborhood in Gary, where survival often meant never standing up too quickly in a world ruled by unyielding prejudice. Yet he carried within him a resolve that was both fragile and fierce. The tension of that day did not end with the closing of class doors. As Marcus walked toward the exit, his eyes met Cody's across the parking lot. It was not a long or meaningful glance. Rather, it was a spark in a powder keg waiting to ignite. Over the next week, Cody's actions grew bolder and more malicious. In history class, Cody began tossing folded paper balls aimed at Marcus with a dismissive snicker, while Brent, ever the conspirator, tripped Marcus during gym so that he might appear clumsy in front of his peers. The cruelty escalated when TJ invaded the sanctity of the locker room one day, knocking over Marcus's backpack and sending his books sprawling across the floor. Despite each act of aggression, Marcus collected his scattered belongings with a quiet dignity and an unspoken resolve, all the while taking meticulous mental notes of every slight and every insult hurled his way. Each name, every sneer, was stored away as evidence of the injustice he endured daily. Marcus had been no stranger to hardship. In Gary, he had learned early on that survival depended on keeping silent when the world around you sought to break you. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, a mantra passed down through generations. You never start fights, but if one starts with you finish it quick and clean. Marcus had spent nearly a decade mastering Shotokan karate under the wise guidance of a local sensei, learning the art of defense and the importance of controlled action. Yet he kept this knowledge hidden, a silent force reserved for moments when his resilience was pushed to its limits. For now he clung to his calm, silent demeanor as both shield and sword in a world that prized conformity and detested the unusual. The true turning point of that tumultuous week came on a crisp Wednesday afternoon after a strenuous gym class. As Marcus emerged from the locker room, he found Cody, Brent, and TJ waiting with a predatory intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Their demeanor was markedly different that day. Void of the usual rehearsed sneers and playful arrogance, Cody stepped forward with his arms folded firmly across his chest, his eyes fixed on Marcus with a hatred that seemed to be nourished by every glance and whisper. "So here's the thing," Cody began in a tone that brooked no argument. "You have been walking around here like you think this school belongs to you, like you own a piece of it." The words were not merely a challenge, they were a proclamation that Marcus was an interloper, unworthy of the space he inhabited. Brent's voice joined in with a bitter laugh. "We take care of people who think they're too good for us." His eyes gleamed with a cruelty that was both calculated and savage. In that charged moment, Marcus's heart pounded not just with fear, but with an overwhelming sense of isolation and defeat. He responded in a measured voice that betrayed none of the inner turmoil churning within him. "You want something?" His question was not a threat, but a plea for an end to this relentless harassment. Yet TJ grinned with a menace that promised further devastation. "Yeah, $20. Consider it your transfer fee for being here." For an instant, time seemed to freeze. The air was heavy with the weight of unspoken resentments and the bitterness of a society that had long marginalized those who were different. In a beat of silence that stretched out like an eternity, Marcus's eyes met those of his aggressors. He knew that any sign of reaction might only fuel the fire of their contempt. With a calm that belied the raging storm within, he simply stepped aside and walked away. As he passed them, the murmurs and snickers that followed were not those of a triumphant crowd, but of a cruel audience relishing the humiliation of a man already weighed down by the legacy of racial discrimination. That day, as the final bell of the school day rang, the corridors echoed with whispers and half-spoken threats of retribution. The insidious rumor spread like wildfire. They're going to get him after school. It did not matter who started it or how much fuel had been added to the smoldering coals of animosity, the message was clear. There were those who wanted him erased from the fabric of their everyday lives. On Friday, as the week's tension reached a breaking point, Marcus followed his familiar routine despite the palpable dread that clung to every step he took through the hallways. With his books packed carefully and his hoodie zipped up to conceal the subtle signs of his anxiety, He moved toward the exit like a man resigned to fate. Yet fate, as it often does, had other ideas. At the edge of a deserted area behind the old gym, with cracked concrete steps and a broken vending machine that hummed a mournful tune, he found them waiting in a triangle formation, their presence ominous and foreboding. Cody's arms were crossed, his stance rigid and predatory. Brent leaned casually against a crumbling wall, twirling a lanyard around his finger as if it were a symbol of their collective authority, while TJ stood silently, each movement deliberate and laden with silent menace. Marcus paused about 10 feet away and, with a voice that was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, asked, "Do you really want to do this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the implication of consequences and unspoken challenges. Cody's laughter erupted in response, harsh and cruel. "Man, I have been waiting for this. What? You think you're some kind of ninja?" he taunted, his voice rising in both volume and venom. Marcus took a measured step forward and replied softly, "I'm not here to fight." It was not a plea or an invitation to negotiate. It was a statement of his determination not to give in to their despicable demands. Brent's chuckle followed shortly, a sound that reeked of mockery. "You got a smart mouth for someone outnumbered," he sneered. Marcus's eyes, reflecting pain and determination all at once, scanned the trio of aggressors before him. In that moment, he recognized that the combined force of their contempt was not merely a physical confrontation, but an assault on his very identity. Their cruelty was rooted in an ancient prejudice, a bias that saw him not just as a rival for power, but as an intruder in a world that insisted on keeping its boundaries rigid and its members segregated by skin color and heritage. Over the course of that fateful week, as the tension built and the whispered rumors turned to outright declarations of intent, Marcus's once quiet existence became a crucible for a conflict that echoed far beyond the walls of Dayton Central. Even the teachers, though powerless to dismantle the deeply ingrained social hierarchies, could not help but notice the restless energy that gripped the halls. In a classroom that normally resonated with the gentle murmur of lectures and the scratching of pencils against paper, the atmosphere was charged with an undercurrent of impending violence. A soft voice from the back of the class murmured a hope that Marcus might somehow vanish from their midst. But vanish he did not. Instead, he continued on his path with the quiet resolve of a man who had borne his share of life's cruelties and yet refused to succumb. The confrontation reached its crescendo one final time on that Friday afternoon, when Marcus found himself face to face with his tormentors in a desolate spot behind the aging gymnasium. The circle they formed was as symbolic as it was literal, a prison of prejudice from which there was no escape unless he fought back. Cody's eyes burned with a fury that bordered on madness as he threw the first punch. A clumsy, wild swing that was all force and no technique. Instinctively, Marcus sidestepped the blow, his body moving not with the showy flair of a fighter, but with the quiet precision of someone who had rehearsed his every move in moments of relentless abuse. With a swift movement, he caught Cody's wrist mid-swing, twisting it just enough to send his opponent off balance. The force of the twist sent Cody stumbling forward, his face contorting in pain and confusion as he tried to regain his footing. Before Marcus could steady his breathing, Brent attacked next. In a seamless motion born from years of training and an innate sense of calm under pressure, Marcus shifted his weight and used Brent's own momentum against him, sweeping his leg out from under the towering bully. Brent crashed to the ground with a thud, the impact knocking the breath from him and leaving him sprawled in a defeated heap. Then came TJ, the silent giant, whose imposing frame belied an inner cruelty that few could fathom. With the force of a charging bull, TJ lunged at Marcus, determined to turn the quiet defiance of his target into an opportunity for domination. But Marcus, ever the embodiment of controlled resilience, timed his sidestep perfectly, delivering a precise palm strike to TJ's ribs, followed by a leg sweep that left the aggressor on his back, stunned. The entire melee unfolded in a matter of seconds, a flash of conflict that seemed to stretch on into an eternity for Marcus's racing heart. Standing amid the subdued forms of Cody, Brent, and TJ, Marcus took a deep breath. his expression calm yet haunted by the weight of each blow that had landed in that brutal dance. No blood stained his clothes, no visible bruises marred his skin, but inside the wounds ran deep. Cody, now coughing and gasping for air, managed to croak out, "What the hell was that?" His voice, once dripping with cruelty, now trembled with confusion as Marcus looked down at him and replied simply, "That is what happens when you pick the wrong fight." With those words, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving behind a scene that would reverberate through the halls of Dayton Central for days to come. In the wake of that confrontation, the school buzzed with whispers and furtive glances. Even though Marcus had not intended to make an example of himself, his quiet defiance had inadvertently forced everyone to reckon with the raw undercurrents of racism and cruelty that simmered beneath the surface. Within a span of a few days, the tale of the calm storm, a nickname that had been hastily assigned to him, spread like wildfire throughout the campus. But for Marcus Steele, the label was a bitter reminder of a life marred by discrimination and the ceaseless judgment of those who measured worth by the color of one's skin rather than the strength of one's character. Every step Marcus took down the long corridors of the school was now shadowed by the echoes of that fateful fight, a constant reminder of the war that raged within him between the desire to remain unseen and the burgeoning need to demand respect. Every snide whisper and every sidelong glance intensified the internal conflict he fought each day, a battle between a heart bruised by relentless prejudice and a spirit that yearned for dignity. He was a man whose silence was not born of fear alone, but of a deep-seated understanding that in a world dominated by cruelty, true power lay in restrained strength and measured action. The cruelty of his tormentors was never simply about a petty dispute over money or misplaced bravado. For Marcus, it was the manifestation of a society long divided by old wounds and bitter rivalries, an environment where a man with his heritage was seen as less than, unworthy of equal footing. Cody, Brent, and TJ were not just bullies. They were symbols of an unyielding system that thrived on racial prejudice and the systematic dehumanization of those who did not fit the mold. Their taunts, their physical assaults, and their very presence were reflections of a broader narrative, one that sought to diminish and silence the very voice of someone like Marcus Steele. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of that violent Friday afternoon lingered in every classroom and every whispered conversation in the locker rooms. Marcus carried the weight of each encounter with a solemn grace, a quiet resignation that was intermingled with an unspoken promise of eventual retribution. Despite the scars, both visible and invisible, that marred his body and soul, there remained within him a defiant ember of hope, a hope that one day the scales of injustice might finally be tipped in his favor. It was a hope built on the legacy of his grandfather, a man who had faced down unimaginable horrors in the jungles of Vietnam and emerged with an unbroken spirit and an unwavering belief in honor. For Marcus Steele, that day at Dayton Central was far from an isolated incident. It was a prologue to a series of events that would test the limits of his endurance, challenge the boundaries of a racially divided society, and ultimately force him to confront the demons of both his past and the present. The cruelty he experienced was not merely a personal affront. It was a call to arms for every soul that had ever been pushed to the margins. In the quiet aftermath of the fight, as the whispers turned to murmurs of shared understanding and even sympathy, Marcus realized that his path of silent endurance was coming to a crossroads. The time had come when restraint could no longer mask the simmering anger at the injustice that had defined so many of his days. Standing alone against the forces of racism and cruelty, Marcus Steele began to see his own suffering in a new light. Each act of discrimination, each insult flung in his direction, became a brick in the fortress of his eventual redemption. A redemption that promised not only to reclaim his own dignity, but also to send shockwaves through the very heart of the oppressive system that sought to keep him subdued. In that moment of introspection, he resolved that his silence would no longer be a shield to hide behind. It would instead be transformed into a silent vow of retribution, one that would one day erupt in a spectacular demonstration of strength and resolve that no one could ignore. For the sake of every person who had ever been treated as less than human, for every soul that had been burdened by the weight of prejudice, Marcus determined that his future response would be nothing short of monumental. And though the days following that pivotal confrontation were fraught with uncertainty and sorrow, there lay within them the seeds of an uprising. A dramatic shift that would not only force the world to reckon with its injustices, but would also provide a glimmer of hope for those whose voices had long been silenced. In recounting this tale, dear listener, I invite you to remember that beneath every act of cruelty lies a story of resilience and latent strength. Marcus Steele, the quiet and unassuming young man who had once wished only to remain invisible, was about to embark on a journey that would rewrite the rules of engagement between the oppressor and the oppressed. And as history has shown us time and again, sometimes it takes the most unassuming soul to ignite a revolution that unfolds not with the clamor of violence, but with the resonant echo of justice finally served. In the days that followed, as Dayton Central's corridors continued to buzz with the debates and disputes of daily high school life, Marcus's plight served as a mirror reflecting the deep fissures of discrimination and cruelty in our society. His struggle was not merely for personal vindication, but for every individual who had suffered in silence under the weight of systemic prejudice. And though his fight had begun with a single moment of defiance, its reverberations were destined to reshape the narrative of an entire community. A community that, for too long, had allowed the forces of hate and marginalization to dictate its course. As we reflect on the early chapters of Marcus Steele's journey, it is clear that his story is one of bittersweet triumph, a quiet rebellion against a system that would reduce him to nothing more than an outsider. His measured actions on that grey Wednesday and his painful endurance in the face of relentless bullying were both a testament to the strength of the human spirit and a call for a reckoning that would eventually bring forth a retaliatory surge so potent and so grand that even the cold, calculating hearts of his adversaries would be forced to confront the consequences of their cruelty. Dear listener, let this tale not be one merely of violence and retaliation, but also a tribute to the enduring human capacity for compassion and redemption. In the heart of every struggle against oppression lies the promise of a future where kindness triumphs over cruelty, where justice tempers retribution, and where the quiet determination of a single soul can transform the narrative of an entire generation. And so, as the storm of conflict brewed on the neglected fringes of that aging gymnasium, Marcus Steele silently vowed that his future actions would be more than just reactions to injustice. They would be the blazing beacon of change that would one day illuminate the darkest corners of our divided world. This is the beginning of a story that, with time, promises to elevate the conflict from mere bullying to a battle for dignity and respect. A battle that draws on every lesson of past hardships, every scar borne in silence, and every whisper of hope that suggests a better tomorrow. As the community grappled with the fallout of that day's events, it became clear that the struggle was far from over. And in that struggle, Marcus Steele, once a quiet and unassuming presence, was poised to emerge as the symbol of resistance that the world so desperately needed. Marcus Steele never broke a sweat when he moved through the halls after that fateful confrontation. His poise was so magnetic that even the girls in the corridors would stop and stare a little longer, their eyes lingering on the quiet confidence he exuded. The boys, too, offered him nods of respect as he passed by, and even a few of the freshmen, wide-eyed and curious, asked him later if he would teach them to move with such measured purpose. Yet Marcus maintained his silent resolve, sticking to his own path despite the heavy silence that had become the unspoken rebuttal of Cody and his cronies. Unlike before, when Cody and his crew hurled insults and crude remarks at every turn, there was now a silence that spoke volumes. A silence that declared their defeat without a single word directed at him. In the days that followed, the repercussions of that fight rippled through every facet of school life. The whispers in the hallways became louder than ever, and while most students admired Marcus for his unwavering calm, they could not ignore the unyielding disdain that lingered from Cody and his gang. These former tormentors now moved with downcast eyes and clenched shoulders, their once boastful stride replaced by a cautious shuffle. TJ's bruised eye and Brent's temporary limp served as constant reminders of that brutal encounter, while Cody habitually fiddled with his wrist, a painful souvenir of his own hubris. Despite these visible signs of defeat, no teacher or administrator intervened, because no one was willing to acknowledge what truly transpired behind those cold, concrete walls. Later that afternoon, in the locker room after gym, Cody finally broke his silence. Standing at the end of the row of lockers with his gaze fixed on the floor, Cody asked in a low and trembling voice why Marcus had not hurt them worse. Marcus paused from tying his shoes and looked up, his expression a mixture of quiet strength and deep-seated sadness. He explained that he did not need to inflict further pain because he had already sent a clear message. Cody muttered afterwards that he had thought Marcus was soft, a remark that stung more than any physical blow could have. Marcus simply replied that he had expected more from someone who claimed to be smarter, and with that, he walked out, leaving Cody without the usual snappy comeback for the first time. This moment marked a turning point. Gradually, Marcus was no longer seen merely as the new kid who stood silently in the background. He was becoming a symbol of resilience and an embodiment of a dignified response to cruelty. Before long, teachers began to notice the shift in the atmosphere that now enveloped the school. Mrs. Lang, his history teacher, called on him more frequently, as if his quiet fortitude demanded acknowledgement. Mr. Alvarez, the PE coach, even paused to offer a nod of approval and mentioned that he had heard Marcus handled himself like a real man that day. Though Marcus would modestly reply that he tried his best and continued on with his day, not everyone was pleased by the growing respect he was earning. Rumors quickly found their way into the ears of concerned parents, who complained at a lengthy parent-teacher meeting about the violence that had erupted on campus. While no one directly named Marcus, his presence was unmistakable in the undercurrent of fear and uncertainty that even the adults found unsettling. That same week, Marcus was pulled from class to meet with Mrs. Hayworth, the school counselor, who greeted him with a soft, practiced smile and asked how he was adjusting to the tumultuous environment. When she inquired about the incident that had rocked the school, Marcus simply shrugged, saying that he had only told the aggressors to leave him alone, and when they did not, he defended himself as he had to. Mrs. Hayworth, with a measured nod, asked him if he felt safe, to which Marcus met her gaze firmly and replied that he felt fine, remarking that sometimes people just do not like being shown that they are not as tough as they believe. Her gentle concern was met with his quiet determination to maintain his sense of self in the midst of chaos. After school that day, Marcus sat alone on the edge of the football field, his eyes following the relentless drills of the junior varsity team practicing under the fading light. His silence was soon interrupted by a quiet voice. Devin Lee, a soft-spoken junior known for his meticulous sketches in a battered notebook, joined him. Devin hesitated before finally asking if Marcus had ever trained somewhere. With a slight smile, Marcus confessed that he had back home, training that had instilled in him a philosophy about strength and restraint. Devin was astonished, remarking that he had never seen anyone move with such precision that he had expected Marcus to snap his tormentor's arm at any moment. Marcus explained that it was never about displaying raw power or looking tough. Instead, it was about understanding the full scope of what he was capable of and choosing not to use that strength unnecessarily. Devin's earnest plea soon evolved into a deeper conversation about the reasons behind his own perpetual victimization. He admitted that he was tired of always being picked on and simply laughing it off. His quiet yearning to walk down the halls with the same dignified poise that Marcus exhibited struck a chord. Marcus, his eyes thoughtful and softening with empathy, agreed to take Devin under his wing. With genuine warmth and care, he explained that the purpose of training was never to incite more violence or to become aggressive, but rather to learn to avoid conflict and carry oneself with an unyielding presence even when threatened. It was not about fighting. It was about the confidence to walk away and the inner strength to stand tall in the face of adversity. As the school year drew to a close, Marcus received a quiet yet profound acknowledgement of his leadership during the spring assembly when he was awarded a Leadership Through Action honor. There was no grand speech, just a brief announcement from the principal, followed by warm, respectful fist bumps from many of his peers. That evening, as Marcus sat on the porch with his beloved grandfather, Leon, the gentle moonlight illuminated the yard freshly trimmed that morning. In a soft, reflective tone, Marcus recounted the events of the day, the struggles, the silent battles, and the surprising seeds of change that had taken root. His grandfather listened, nodding with a tired smile that carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. He remarked simply that true strength was not measured by volume or aggression, but by the quiet dignity of knowing who you are when no one else is watching. In that peaceful moment, Marcus understood that his journey had come full circle. His initial desire to simply avoid trouble had evolved into a steady resolve to stand up against the cruelty that permeated his world. His calm had become a clarion call for respect, a beacon for those who had been bruised by prejudice and fear, and as he looked out over the yard, he realized that real power lay not in loud proclamations or reckless anger, but in the slow, steady progress of reclaiming one's dignity, one measured step at a time. For every person who had ever felt small or outnumbered, Marcus's story was a reminder that change often begins in silence, that the most remarkable acts of vengeance and redemption can be subtle yet profound. And so, with the promise of a better tomorrow echoing in his heart, he resolved that his legacy would not be one of revenge for revenge's sake, but of a dignified resurgence that would leave everyone who heard his story in awe.